Welcome to Human Resources for the People. It's a human capital revolution. If you like what you heard today, please like, share, and subscribe for more content about people-centered HR. The Baldwin-Felts major of the Guard Patrol slapped the hood of the improvised armor car. In the dusty southern Colorado desert, the former car had plated steel added to the front, as well as gun turrets fitted to suppress fire. The words "Death Special" was emblazoned on the front of the car for maximum intimidation. The cold air kept the hood cold, but it was mid-April in Las Animas County and the temperature was soon to rise. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company of Southern Colorado formed from the merger of two massive companies, the Colorado Coal and Iron Company and the Colorado Fuel Company. The Colorado Coal and Iron was already one of the largest landowners in Colorado, and the founding of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company exacerbated and accelerated its power in the southern coal fields of Colorado. America's manifest destiny was enveloping the West. The gold rush of 1848 led to the development of previously unknown lands. America's growing industrial consumption habits required the exploration of more of America's wilderness. Like West Virginia, the western United States mining apparatus relied on the isolation of the surrounds. The remoteness served an oligopoly. The laborers struggled to leave their jobs and were dependent on the beneficence of the mining companies to leave. There was also another similarity to West Virginia. The importance of the railroads led to an isolation mechanism for the workers. The Colorado Coal and Iron Company established a mine at Berwind, Colorado in the late 19th century. The Colorado Fuel Company later merged with the Colorado Coal and Iron Company, and as a result, the camp came under the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company was owned by John D. Rockefeller, one of the preeminent industrialists of the era. The miners were able to build their own houses in the area, but they were very shabby. The miners had little choice. The area had no housing. To respond to the housing crisis created by the exploration, the company began building housing for the employees to live in. The miners had many issues with working with the company there in Ludlow, Colorado. One of the issues the miners had with respect was with respect to pay and not paying for dead work. Dead work was any work that did not directly contribute to the mining of ore. This was a common practice throughout the mining community, including West Virginia, but as a result, it led to miners taking shortcuts with respect to safety and among other vital tasks that were not being paid for. That included the felling of timber and the cleaning of the machinery which mining required. On September 23, 1913, nearly all the miners left the work sites on strike, constituting over 10,000 miners which decided to strike for their rights. This represented over 90% of the workforce in the southern Colorado coalfields. As a result, the company began to evict the miners, forcing them into United Mine Worker tent camps at the mouth of the canyon near the mine. Ludlow was the largest of the tent camps. In September of 1913, a mine guard was deputized to arrest some of the striking miners in Segundo, Colorado, who had been vandalizing company property. The striking miners saw the coming mine guard and ambushed him, killing him. When interrogated later regarding their behavior, the strikers alleged that the mine guard regularly mocked them and cajoled them about their wives, and they were finished with his behavior. In early October in southern Colorado, the Mine Guards, National Guard, and drafted militiamen from the company began to emplace artillery on the hills surrounding the Ludlow colony with its sights placed on the men, women, and children striking against the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. As a result of the artillery and the mounting tension between the striker and the government, and the employer, the shelves of gun stores in the area began to empty. The strikers were not willing to accept the government and company suppression. Amongst the intermittent snow and rain of the high altitude, the miners were steadfast in their strike. On October 8, 1913, the Colorado and Southern Railroad line connecting the mine to the Front Range had a locomotive outfitted with a machine gun to harass the miners. The the striking miners never took initial casualties from these beginning innovative measures to break up the camps. It created the train created a suppressing fire motion that the strikers were unable to fight against. The train was too solid. Mark Powell, who was a rancher, was herding cattle near the Colorado and Southern Railroad bridge. The bridge began taking fire from an unknown location. The train guards surveilling the bridge fired on to Mark Powell, killing him. The strikers called Ludlow the White City for the canvas that made up the walls of the city. On April 19th, the Ludlow strikers were celebrating Greek Orthodox Easter. A few Greek strikers began the celebrations, but the entire camp joined in. The strikers were picnicking, playing baseball, and roasting a lamb. Militiamen arrived at the camp armed fully with Remington rifles. Insults began being thrown about at the militiamen from the women in the camp. It was unknown who began to shoot, but once both sides began shooting, gunfire laid heavy onto the camp. The Colorado National Guardsmen held the high ground above the camp. It was a small force, only 34 strong. The war had been burning at a very low level prior to this, with assassination after assassination, skirmish after skirmish. But all of a sudden, on April 19th, it became blazing hot. The Colorado National Guard and the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company began firing machine guns into the crowded campers, killing 21 and wounding scores. Shortly after midday, the National Guardsman, Private Martin, was caught by a bullet from one of the strikers. The Guardsman retaliated by mowing down 12-year-old Frank Snyder, who had left the safety of a cellar either to look for food or to relieve himself. Through the course of the day, more would die. The leader of the Greek strikers, Luis Tikas, took 3 shots to the back. To hide from the line of fire of the machine gun stationed above the town, 11 children and 2 women hid underneath the tent in the encampment. The National Guard set a fire at one of the tents with gasoline, with the hot desert air propelling the flames further. A fire rapidly spread through the tent colony, engulfing the tents. Many of the tents had cellars dug deep into the soil to preserve food. The women and children hid in the cellars to preserve themselves. One of the tents was set on fire, and 2 of the women and all of the children were suffocated in the fumes and flames set by the militias. This hole in the ground where the women and children died became known as the Black Hole. The firestorm destroyed the tent colony at Ludlow, which was strafed by machine guns. The militias took to looting and destroying the camp with what stood. Many of the miners were able to escape the inferno after running out of ammunition. They were able to hide because a commercial train passed through the area, blocking the view of the machine gun net. The legacy of Ludlow was in the American consciousness heavily. Many liken it to the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in terms of anti-capitalist fervor. While events like the Haymarket riot stirred the public to condemn and exclude socialists and anarchists, the Ludlow massacre had the opposite effect. Ludlow and other similar strikes stemmed from repeated depressions and recessions which both capital and labor went through. The long-term impact of John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s intention to both improve his image and reduce the long-term supply chain effects of strikes and labor strife resulted in a representation program that created engagement and created buy-in in the industrial space. The representation plans created an employee that was more engaged with the coworkers and workforce. As a result, they produced higher outputs. These plans were first known as the Colorado Industrial Plan, and it brought more than simple employee engagement. It brought stability and understanding. The industrial plan required that employees go through a progressive disciplinary process. It stated that employees would not be terminated automatically except for some zero tolerance reasons. In addition, it allowed for the employees to employ their own check weighers. A check weigher was a person who confirmed the amount of ore that was mined from the mountain. The ability to have independent check weighers for their ore was critical in reducing conflict between the employee and the company. The new program had a social justice or cultural component. It had a committee to improve the schools, houses, and other components of the employees' lives outside of work. The Colorado coal strike lasted for over a year, with strikers living in tent camps throughout southern Colorado. It was ultimately a Pyrrhic victory for the strikers and for the Union of United Mine Workers of America. The strikers lost the battle, but they won the war. The resultant public opinion turned against John D. Rockefeller Jr., as well as the rest of the mine operators in the region. It helped Franklin Delano Roosevelt pass the Wagner Act several decades later to aid in the formalizing of labor relations. In 1990, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company finally declared bankruptcy. Like much of the steel producers in the 1980s and 1990s, it was beaten by foreign competition. The location continued under new owners. I hope you enjoyed this somber review of the Ludlow Massacre, one of the bloodiest labor events in American history.